You're listening to the CDD-Ghana Democracy Dialogues podcast, a platform for meaningful conversations on governance, democracy, and development. From policy discussions to citizen perspectives, we explore key topics like electoral reforms, economic policies, and human rights. Join the conversation on YouTube, Spotify, and our website. Stay informed, stay inspired.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the CDD-Ghana Democracy Dialogues. My name is Nwokolo, and I will be moderating the discussion today. I am particularly excited about this conversation for two reasons. One, the discussants, whom I will be introducing in a moment, and then two, the topic, which I'll say is quite timely as we settle into sort of a new government administration and starts the time on what we expect them to prioritize. So today's discussion really just examines Ghana's political, economic, and social landscape following the elections and our journey to strengthen our democracy and transforming the economy. So joining me are two well-versed and distinguished colleagues. I have Professor Kwasi Prempeh, who is a legal scholar and governance expert, also the executive director of the Ghana CDD office. And very recently, the chairman of the Constitutional Review Committee. We're excited about that. Congratulations. My other discussant is Dr. Ohene, who is a Democracy and Development Fellow of CDD-Ghana. Aside from that, we have an equally impressive profile, having spent several years on Wall Street, working as CEO for Royal Bank of Scotland's Global Credit Business, and as Senior Vice President at the New York City Economic Development Corporation, I believe it is. So I'm cognizant of the time, so I'll get straight into things. Before we tackle the essence of our conversation, I'm curious from both of you, and I can start with you, Professor Prempeh. If Ghana's political and economic landscape were a movie, what would its title be and why? I'm sure you weren't ready for that angle.
Oh, this is absolutely not. This is quite a curveball. If Ghana was a movie, what would its title be? If you took it over time, I think Ghana has gone through these cycles of, boom and bust on the economic side and on the political side as well. I mean, we've gone through some very low points, and I think we are now emerging. I would say great brand, not entirely greater product.
Fair enough. And Prof, what would the type of movie be on your side?
I will actually title it Up in Smoke, Exodus Part 2. And the reason why I will actually title it Up in Smoke is that I don't know if you've seen there's a movie called Chik Chon Chong, Up in Smoke. You're never sure what is going to happen next, and you're always wondering whether the folks in charge at any moment in time actually are aware of the rules. But if I step back, much like what Kwasi was saying, I envision it as sort of having sort of been in the desert, as sort of Exodus, but then we've been lost in the desert. So once in a while, you get somebody who comes up, he says, okay, hey, we should go in this direction. And then we all follow the person and we realize that, oh, we're even more lost, right? But it's all happening because the folks actually don't pay attention to the map. We are a bit almost like in a puzzle, and we're trying to figure out, but what it is that the process of actually figuring it out itself, we are kind of lost on it, right? So that's how I'll basically title it Up in Smoke.
We still see some challenges, right, in institutional independence and accountability. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the key sort of critical weaknesses in our democratic institutions and some ideas you have around ways we could start to fix them?
When it comes to our democracy, I think we have definitely done well, relatively speaking, and especially within the context of our history, of our past. We have certainly gotten to a point where we have stabilized our politics somewhat. We made steady progress, and we have also, I think, done well in terms of building a national consensus around the term limits, right? So Ghanaians, unlike other countries in the neighborhood that continue to struggle with term limits, I think it's one of those things in Ghana for which there is very firm cross-party as well as popular consensus. Nobody wants to mess up, nobody wants to mess with that. But I think that is it. I mean, that beyond elections, the problem really becomes how we govern in the period in between the elections. And there, I think, is where we fail. So, it's in the governance bit, in between elections where the real governance, business of governance happens. That is where, unfortunately, we fail. And that, of course, is a very costly failure because it does mean that for 4 years, we are usually lost somewhere in the desert, to paraphrase Ohene Kwapong. In between those elections, the country has generally been poorly governed. Accountability systems are very weak. We have a lot of voice without accountability. You can say whatever you like on radio or TV, but to no effect. Right? You can say whatever you like in parliament, but to no effect. Right? And so elections have become basically about the only check, unfortunately, in the system, which really does present a challenge, right? And I think some of that is demonstrated every election year by how much tension there is in the air when we are approaching elections, because that's a do and die for both the citizens and for the political class. And when you put so much weight, the entire weight of accountability in the system on periodic elections, then the integrity of that elections also becomes something that becomes up for grabs, because the political class then want to control the election. It's the only way you really check them. So they both have an incentive opportunistically to want to control it, to want to end it, manipulate it. So we're always getting into elections very tensed up. And that's a real problem. So I think the real problem is, how do we govern well in between elections? How do we activate all the institutions of checks and balances so that in the 4-year period, we're able to hold leadership accountable, don't have to wait for elections every time? If it keeps going that way, my fear is that if we're not able to uphold the integrity of elections, then everything goes up in smoke. So I'm going back to Hineko here. That is actually up in smoking. Yeah.
So what are we missing, right, in terms of spreading the accountability, and why is that still the case? Because it's not the first set of elections we've had a new challenge. So where are we failing? Where are we dropping the ball? What are we refusing?
I think it's a number of things. We are a people, it's almost like a congenital kind of obsessed with politics from the beginning. Right. And so the whole game of politicking, trying to win power, has become an end in itself. It's not as if politics has to be just a means, right? And then the end is really to govern. We're so obsessed with the latter, the politics bit. We invest too much in the politics, in the game, in the business of getting power, and not nearly enough in the business of governing and actually really using the power to change lives, to really do the hard work of policy making, policy implementation, changing lives, changing outcomes, and the like. And one of the reasons, that maybe so, it's also, the winner take all character of our politics, too much money going into politics, and therefore, time that should be spent governing is time spent recouping campaign finance investments, which also, of course, affects a lot of things. The quality of recruitments that you make into government, into the public service generally, the kinds of contracts you award, the kinds of projects or infrastructure you even select, is driven a lot by how you do the politics to get into power. So this overload of the politics has huge ramifications in the post-election period for a lot of the things that actually we must do for policy, for selection of personnel, for selection of infrastructure projects, for corruption, everything for fighting corruption. But all of those things are affected because of how we do our politics and because of how much we invest doing the politics bit and not the post-politics governance.
Professor Ohene, I'm coming to you, and I'm curious to know your thoughts on this subject, but also how we change the incentives, right, around getting leadership to change the status quo, right? How can we shift this to what we want it to be? Because it's not in quote unquote their best interest, right, to do that because they can't get away with it as the system is set up now. So I'm curious to know your thoughts on the question in general, but also how we shift the needle around getting things to work better.
So let me start off from where Kwasi started at the beginning. He said that we have gotten to a point where we've had some wins in terms of term limits and being able to sort of hold elections and all that stuff. I will say it's almost as if we've been on the soccer field. We've had some good passes and we know how to sort of pass the ball. Some of these wins that Kwasi refers to as sort of the term limits and that cycle, it's sort of by default has also been part of the global and external environment. We cannot misbehave like we used to. In the 70s where we just got up and we overthrew governments and all that stuff, we really sort of, the spotlight is on, right? There are more external parties who have skin in the game of Ghana. So in a sense, that has been a good pressure on us to sort of behave, right? So it's almost as if we in between when the time comes and we're on the stage, we behave, and then when we're not in the stage, we are really not doing the acting correctly. And that's what Kwasi refers to. If our listeners have sort of read John Dewey's book on democracy and education, what happens is that Ghana's population has gone from the 70s about almost 6 million to 32 million, right? That also means that if a country is going to be able to sustain that growth and really power on in development, it's got to educate every new kid that's born. And at times, I just get a sense that we have had a lot of citizens that sort of have come into the system called Ghana. But what it is that they haven't really caught up with civics. It's almost like it's running away from us. If you look at Ghana in the 60s, 70s, 80s, the passion that was there, the way people basically had conversations on radio, the respect and everything, it's almost as if that has all disappeared. And I think it's largely because the in-between that Kwasi refers to, there is something that we sort of have missed and we really have not paid attention to, and it's basically killing us, right? Number one, our social organization. Somehow we don't understand the fact that to be able to mobilize resources to actually do the things that the citizens will be happy about means that you actually also have to organize yourself, right? So our cities, our towns, our whatever, we've had local government ministry for a long time, but I bet a lot of people in Ghana don't even know what a city is or what a city should have or what a town even should have. So that has been taken for granted. So obviously, guess what happened? It sucks up a lot of resources. It sucks up a lot of arguments. We argue and argue. It sets up a lot of missed opportunities in education. You can go into parliament and do all the laws you want, right? But when you do a law, it's just on paper. The next big problem, and probably the hardest part, is to create what I'll call the manual. The manual that says, okay, this is how you actually implement the law, right? And we've taken a lot of that for granted. So it's no secret that literally when times comes to governing, people are sort of, they do the easiest thing, the low hanging fruit, which is just drive around, just get the greetings and show that you're in power. And in the meantime, guess what? The best thing is you're not being held accountable. because the whole country is sort of going away from us. So it's almost as if the country actually does not have a thinking center. So what happens is that, we end up coming up with manifestos here, manifestos there, manifestos here, manifestos there. So literally, we don't have a map. What we have is everybody has their own pocketbook, and we look at it, and so that pocketbook is not, you don't govern with manifesto, you know, and there's not even a thinking center that we can actually throw everybody's manifesto to and say, okay, take the best and make sure it provides continuity. So to me, I think the first thing that probably needs to be done, and we have to sort of ask ourselves is, are we actually taking education, the extraordinary intervention it ought to be, and doing it well? And are we really getting the civics right? So that at least for the first time, you can get the people who are coming in, participating in the politics, going into parliament, wanting to stand for offices and whatnot, somehow have an idea what Ghana is all about. Going from 6 million to 35 million, the question is, what have you done to that asset, that human capital, for you to even reap the benefit of having the talent to govern? Right. So that's sort of my initial thoughts on that.
If it is about governing, about making policy, about putting the country, in some 20-year, 15, 20-year perspective, the parties are not primed to do that. And yet these are the primary vehicles by which we're going to recruit the people going around this country. And you see that immediately after the elections, as we're witnessing, the interest is in who gets appointed to what, not in who has the ability to solve a problem. Right. Not in who. So these are not problem-solving entities. They're just they become like mutual benefit societies that are just there to help their members. Right. And then sometimes when you raise queries about that, they say, "Oh, but are they not also Ghanaians?" Right. But it is not. The government is a problem-solving institution. Politics is about solving public problems with public power and public resources. But that's not what our parties are primed to do, right? So even if you took just the basic building block of our democracy, the party, there's a big disconnect between the party and the challenges that we face as a country and how we get to solve them. It's like the structure we have created and the function, are not aligned, right? We have a certain, yeah, that is misaligned in terms of objectives and goals. And, so if you don't belong to a party, if you are Kwapong, you stay out of the party and you can't raise money and you can't run for election, or you can't support, you are not a patron for anybody, it doesn't matter how much you know. Power is it, right? Power is knowledge here. And we are in a society, we are in a world where knowledge counts for everything. And yet we are playing a game that discounts the value of knowledge and rather puts a premium on, who can raise the most money to win an election, who can shout the loudest, and of course this disfavors not just basically people of without means, but it also disfavors a lot of people, women especially. It's not surprising that so few women are in our politics. Why? Because the politics is all about raising money, and it's also very muscular. People who are loud, just following from what Nicola said. This is just one clear example of the disconnect between, our politics and then the outcomes we're seeking as a country.
Thank for that. And I really appreciated what Prof. said about, when people come with their different manifestos and it's one thing or the other. And I think that really is one of the key challenges, where somebody comes in reverse before the other version goes completely different. And we don't have this sort of long-term national policy. Right, the parties, it's the other way around. And that's something that needs to shift. And I'm curious to know, from your perspective, both of you, it's like, where does the responsibility fall in terms of trying to create a system where we have these goals that we've agreed to for the next 20, 50 years, and this is what we are trying to do, and everybody's manifesto, maybe the disagreement could be around how to do it, but not what to do. And I'm just curious to know your thoughts a bit.
So if you can move the parties that Kwasi talks about, where the parties really begin to understand what it means to lead in the first place. I don't mind a manifesto. The thing is, it's really more how you create it such that it's inclusive, it represents the country, and it builds on what is already there, right? So that means that, we have to get these parties to open up, right? Whereby, because if you get the parties to open up, if we had two parties where literally primaries are run where it's open up for the entire citizenry, that would be incredible, because then you can't just go and pay 35 million people, however many people we have to vote, right? You actually have to think about starting the communication and discussion earlier on and involving all the facets of society to basically come up with what you see as the next stage. So we can't get to a point where it's okay to have a manifesto, but then it becomes really more about a platform that builds on, gives the people, this is where we're going right now, and it's not driven sort of by party insiders alone, right? So you can get that. But what I really think will also be grateful is this. There are institutions in the country that we can actually build up. For me, one of the things that helps in the democracies that I've lived in that has been so dynamic is, besides the parties they actually have other institutions as well that actually are all stakeholders, and we have to start beginning to bring in these institutions like, TUC and all that, sort of formalize all of them, whereby they actually become major contributors to the discussion. Right now, what happens is that a lot of the institutions, they just sort of align with one party because somebody is going to hold the purse and distribute the goods. So they want to sort of be on that side, right? But I come back to this whole civics thing, that if we can sort of really get the roots solid, whereby the next generation basically are really thinking differently. Ghana has a very high power distance index. What does that mean? It means that every time an older person stands up to speak, all the young people basically shut up. You cannot live in the modern world and develop with that type of core character of a nation. We got to get into a place where the best of our young is displayed. If I tell you how many young people around the world have basically pushed the boundaries of democracy because through activism, it's amazing. And now we have kids who can do that. But what it is that we sort of have to begin to bring in other institutions, our chieftaincy, for example. I mean, somehow it's not formalized enough so that it can be modernized, right? It's sort of stuck in just this local hum, and then we sort of all sit around and we do greetings and whatnot, So there's something to be said about making sure that we get these parties, as Kwasi said, to be a bit more an educational institution as well, where they see that responsibility of thinking through. I mean, if we can't have a thinking center, let's at least have thinking centers where people can litigate the best of things and come out and whatnot. It makes it easier for them to then open up, where they basically then begin to see that not that they just have to win power, but they actually have to win the minds. And that's the only way the country can have a very, very solid platform where development can happen. So it's a tough challenge, but the second thing I like is somehow, how do we get more institutions to actually be a bit more formalized in the way they engage in the politics, such that we get much more of a distributive power around the whole country, such that every politician in your party quickly recognizes that I need to actually sell. I need to win institutions. I need to win citizens, and I need to bring Ghanaians along. It's just not, right now it's very easy, right? Everybody is asleep. The citizenry doesn't have a very high level of civics, so they don't know what goes on. If somebody gets sacked, if you go and tell some citizens that, oh, by the way, it's against the law, they're like, but the government can do anything, right? That's because they actually have not been educated in it.
In terms of like economy. So obvious talk about how Ghana's, democratic stability is often praised. But our economic instability remains a bit of a recurring issue. We are on our way. 17 program bailout, essentially. No, especially from your point of view, Professor Kwapong. This idea of building a globally competitive economy. We've heard the talk, right? Developing value chains, global economy, industrialization. I mean, who doesn't say it? And yet we don't seem to be able to show our working toward this. I'm curious to
Right.
experience working in some of these other, countries, especially the institutions that are quite, key to growing the economy, or at least trying to create the economic opportunity. Can you share a bit about what are some of the strategic shifts that are needed and achievable to sort of get us on that path to be more competitive? Because we live in a world where it's becoming dire by the day. And if we look at the population in the next 25 years, to create jobs and opportunities for people to earn income, it could be quite problematic in a way that affects everybody, including the untouchables.
Yeah. No, so that's a great question. I'll tell you what has happened in Ghana is that for whatever reason, because we have not done a good job bringing in the talent and the right people in the right places to think through the problems, somehow everything has been very surfacey, right? So every time people talk about industrialization and whatnot, they look at other countries and they basically say, oh, well, okay, let's do this, let's do this. But what they forget is that every country that you can mention that has industrialized actually has a very unique way that they have actually done industrialization. And if you go deeper, it's very hard decisions that were made about resources, about people, how to treat talent and all that stuff, right? Somehow we don't go that deep. So we just sort of take a decision. Okay, let's sell this. Okay, let's create it. Let's do one district, one factory and whatnot, right? One district, one factory that was done, almost 30% were water production. People just getting the money to go and do water, right? It had no basis to basically build any economy on it. But somehow we are under this illusion that somehow because government says it, it will happen. We don't even understand the fact that whatever we want to export, that market, you have to fight for it. The world economy, every product that I can choose can only support about 2 or 3 major global companies. So it's not as easy as just getting up and saying, let me export this, let me export that and whatnot. We need to figure out a way to actually bring the best of our talent in a room and say, okay, let's think about our situation and how we actually do it. State-owned institutions in China are literally private capital entities, meaning that all the provinces are allowed to invest in them as a shareholder. So there are units that actually have multiple shareholders, and there is no political appointment to boards and all that stuff. Those shareholders who are states and regions and towns and districts and municipalities have to actually act like shareholders. So these are, and almost about 50% of them are also listed. So these are institutions that actually they've thought through the structures to put in place to make them work. In our case, we just create a state-owned institution and we hope whatever. No country will ever develop if it does not build its private sector. Companies are the thing that solved countries' problems at the edges. If I give you the 2,000 companies in the world, the US has 753. China has 535. UK have 230. The whole EU has about 300. These companies matter for our economy. So we cannot have an economy where we are not focused on allowing companies to build, thrive, allowing even state-owned institutions to actually work. There is no other way to create and scale jobs. There is no other way. We cannot use a hoe and a sickle in the ground to create agriculture jobs. It will not work. If we cannot actually allow people to build commercial scale agricultural companies where we get out of way as a government and just provide incentives. I mean, think about even national service. Recently there was a whole scandal on national service and whatnot, and we underestimate how much it actually drives the economy. You have a whole bunch of folks, 140,000 students graduating, and they're supposed to go into the workforce, and only 10% gets absorbed, right?
Yeah.
Well, guess what? If you want the government to pay them to do national service, why don't you offer that as a tax incentive or tax credits for the companies to employ them? Then if I'm a company, I would rather employ somebody and get a tax credit to lessen my. Our economy is not going anywhere unless private sector takes off. And then you have the financial services sector, right? Which literally has been a mess, and now we're trying to sort of get back. Again, you have to get the right people in there.
There's sort of a link between your governance, rule of law, and economic development, right? So look up the cloths that we are cut from. I'm curious to know your thoughts on some of the legal, perhaps constitutional changes that can create a more stable environment that allows the private sector to grow, but also investor-friendly economy, because that's equally important.
What connects democracy to develop is good governance, right? So you have democracy. It will not guarantee you development unless you use the power that is entrusted to you. You use it well. Unless you use it competently, unless you use it to solve problems, unless you use it accountably, unless you use it responsibly. So it is the good governance bit, the middle, that actually makes it possible for a democracy to lead to development. In fact, a non-democracy that governs well is more likely to get development than a democracy that, in fact, will get development, while a democracy that misgoverns will not get development. So really, it is the governance bit that connects the two. And when we say at CDD that we call ourselves the Center for Democratic Development, I think there's a concession implicit in that name that there are ways to get to development that may be non-democratic, but we prefer the path to development that is democratic. And that path gets to development through good governance. So it is not negotiable. Once you choose democracy, you must have good governance or you will not get development. Democracy itself will not produce development. And I think that is where the problem is. So we've identified some of the problems. Even the problems of economic, these cycles, these, debt, unsustainable debts, these, lack of fiscal space, these fiscal mismanagement, they're fundamentally governance failures. You see, it is how we handle power, how we govern, whether it's public finance, whether how we even incur debt, what accountability framework is there for the incurrence of debt. And we can actually create a tax system that's fit for purpose, or we don't have time, it's 4 years, let's go to the capital markets and borrow. So even the decision to borrow versus to tax is a governance decision that is driven largely by short-term politics, right? So we go to the capital market, we don't even care about the yield. We want to come back home with the money to celebrate that when we went for this Euro bond, it was oversubscribed, and then we actually have a party about it, right? Because all we're thinking about is this 4-year horizon. We need to win an election to hold on to power. So let's go and get as much money as we can and come in, even without thinking through what we're going to do with the money. A lot of the economic dislocations and distortions that we have gone through and are still experiencing stem out of governance failures, stem out of the ways in which we use and misuse power. The idea of resetting, it's something that has broad appeal, at least from our most recent elections. I think Ghanaians have gotten to a point of saying, look, we're tired of this kind of stuff. We're tired of having democracy without a change in outcomes. Having these cycles of elections that change faces, that change parties, that enrich a few, but fundamentally leave the system the same way it is or worse off, right? And so I think, this idea that, constitutional reform is definitely one part of the solution, because somehow the ways in which we have structured power also account for the ways in which the incentives are misaligned. So what if for once we said, okay, let's reform the way we have done local government. Let's disperse power away from the center to where the problems actually are. The problems are on the ground at local levels. That's where the waste is not being collected. That's where the schools are decrepit. That's where the problems are. So if you said, let us restructure constitutionally, disperse power to the local, let them elect some of the key holders of executive power, mayor or whatever, and let's put an accountability framework around this, but let's make sure that the mayors are also implementing some grand national vision at their local levels. Just the constitution alone has put so many people on the public payroll, and yet there's no value for money coming out of it. So again, it's an opportunity, if you want to reset, to look in the constitution and say, look, is it an efficient document, even from an economic standpoint? Are we hiring the kind of people in the numbers that we need, or are we just creating jobs for in the political establishment, for party people and stuff like that? The laws that govern our lives every day are more in the nature of administrative rules and bylaws and stuff like that. Those are the things we live by on a day-to-day basis. So if you can change everything you want with the constitution, but if, as I was listening to City FM yesterday morning, Ben Havler was talking about all this cattle that are all of a sudden in rush hour. You have cattle on main highways. People are going to work. You have to stop for cattle. So some herder is just rushing cattle through the streets, the roads, and you have aboboyas in rush hour. Aboboyas competing with people running off to get to work at 7 a.m. Why can't you have a rule? Those things the constitution will not solve. The local government must work. The municipality has to have a bylaw, for example, that says, hey, if you are aboboya, rush hour, you are out. You can operate at 10 a.m., but before 10, you can use some other some neighborhood roads, but you can't come on the main road. These are not things you can put in the constitution, right? So our everyday lives are not usually governed by the constitution. It's by usually very local law and administrative rules. And unless we begin to operationalize those and take them seriously, the constitution will be there and not matter a whole lot. It will regulate elite politics, but our daily lives, will not.
Yeah. Because I will even say this, the governance bit that you mentioned, right? Funny enough, I don't think there's a significant population percentage of our people that actually get it. And that probably is our fault in terms of the governing part fault, right? We fail to understand that once you create an institution, you have just created it by edict. But then the first person or the first few people that you appoint to lead that institution are the people who create the rules, the manuals, the how we would do it, and really sort of give flesh to it. And what has happened is, we've created several different institutions, especially in the financial sector side, all these sort of money spending supposedly institutions that literally you don't know who they report to. And then they all get into a scandal. And we're somehow assuming that, how come it did not work? The person who's there did not do this. And no, that is because we forget the fact that every institution, we need strong leadership, at least at minimum, to really launch it, such that the hard work of sort of clarifying things could be done and whatnot. So that governance bit we cannot underestimate just making sure that people really get what it means. It also means jobs. When you get governors at the local level to work, that is job creation. Then you have people taking care of themselves and creating more and more jobs, and people not basically saying, hey, I have to go to Accra. I have to get on bus, go and spend the night in Accra and get some money and whatnot. Align the towns and the cities correctly and whatnot, because that all job creation. So governance is something that I think at times we really underestimate, because I don't think we really understand just how powerful it is. So there are a lot of stuff that we need to sort of bring out in the open and really educate people how it's supposed to work so that people can understand. I mean, if we increase interest rate in Ghana, I mean, do even have the population understand how it affects them? Because they are not engaged. You're letting them even administer themselves. So governance bit is really, really critical.
But I think one of the things that was mentioned earlier in the conversation is hardship. And I got tired of this. It's like the enduring thorn in our flesh, right? Because we know often undermine like reforms, right? Even our policies in this country. How do we build or ensure that some of our institutions are able to resist like state capture and truly serve like national or state progress? Like we've seen in some countries that are sort of dealt with corruption quite well. I'm not saying it's completely gone, but we know the story of, for instance, Georgia. We know Hong Kong. Again, we could talk about size and all of that. But some of the things that they did, right? They went after some of these high-profile officials and basically tried to reset the whole system. Knowing what we know about our political landscape, knowing what we know about Ghana and its history, I'm curious to know, like, two main points from both of you, how we start to tackle this. Or is it we camp that says, develop and then corruption will disappear. We're just corruption because we are poor. I'm curious to know your thoughts on that, but also how we can practically address this as a country.
The problem of corruption here is not that we are, as human beings, we are any different from any other. I think the problem is that there's too much opportunity for corruption. Given the need, given that we are all equally greedy or susceptible to greed, given all of that, which cuts across humans by race or ethnicity or gender, whatever, the main problem of corruption is a problem of opportunity. There is too much opportunity for corruption here, in the fact that there's very little, transparency. There's too much discretion. You give too much power to one person with no rules around it. The president can, do whatever he likes here. This minister can just order something, start it. All of that discretion is liable to abuse. So for me, I think basically and I get back to our politics. Give one clear example. Just having no rules about how campaigns are run. We were recently in Dakar, CDD, observing and helping our civil society partners on some election work. And when I went with my team from Accra, the first thing they observed, these were first-time visitors to Dakar. It was about a month to election, and yet there was not a single billboard that they could spot anywhere, election billboard. They couldn't spot a poster, and they were wondering. And I said, well, you know why? The campaign season hasn't opened. So, oh, okay, here they have a campaign. Yes, they have to open campaign before you can start campaigning. Here, elections were done in December 7th in Ghana. People are still campaigning. It's almost as if still we are not done with the campaign. We haven't had enough of it yet. So the billboards are still standing. Mega billboards, sometimes blinding. You can't even see, if you're driving, you can't even see ahead of you because a billboard is blocking your view. Nothing is regulated. In the Ghanaian context, I'll regulate campaigns from the expenditure side. Can't spend X amount, your bill cannot be this size. You cannot have this number of billboards within this mile radius. You cannot do this number of jingles on the radio during the season. And we start election campaigns a particular day, maybe 2 months to election, and we stop a particular day. So you keep some boundaries around this stuff. So a lot of these things, I think, are related to the question of corruption, right? It's not I think a lot of moral crusades. I think the moral crusades are bound to fail. Because these are not necessarily moral questions. There is some element of it, but how many people can you convert? I mean, so it's not really a moral crusade that will correct us. So there is an aspect in terms of social policy and how it tames the corruption on the motive side, but it's not a moral question. There are things that we can do, but I think we should focus on minimizing the opportunities for corruption, minimizing just the way it's so easy to get away with not doing the right thing. And the people are not paid well, that's why they are corrupt. It's not really the case. I mean, it's not just poverty. It's not poverty that explains the corruption here, because in fact the most corrupt are not the poorest, not the poorest in the country. So I think it's a big issue. I mean, we downplay it sometimes, and I think that's the mistake we make. We like to compartmentalize governance and the economy. You know every government comes and they think the number one problem is the economy, and then governance becomes this other thing that's like some soft issue. The two are intimately related. I'm always nervous when governments, think that the first thing to do is fix the economy. Our economy needs major restructuring and transformation. You can't fix it easily, you know. So until you start sometime from the governance side, which is easier to do, and you build the foundations there, and then some of that confidence you build in the administration of the state, in the public administration, then gives you, the kind of foundation you need to really tackle some of the structural issues in the economy.
So to close us up, I want you both to reflect on and basically speak to the young Ghanaian woman and man desperate to live in a Ghana with a responsive government, a democracy that delivers, right, some sort of a dividend, a functioning economy that allows efforts to be rewarded. What would you say to them it will take to reset Ghana's politics, economy, and society? And most importantly, what is their role in that? Because we talk about things we need to do, but where's the responsibility? How can the individual person sort of play a more active role in that? So
Yes. Okay. Cool. So let me summarize it this way. Sort of speaking to the young people, and then I'll touch on some of the things that Kwasi said. So, just imagine a parking lot, right? Often at times we take a parking lot for granted. When you go to a parking lot, when it's well organized, as in some countries, everybody knows where to park and is parked correctly, facing one direction and whatnot. In a very well organized parking lot, it's very difficult to litter, right? Now, if you go to Abobloshi or any of our parking lots where it's not organized and it's chaotic, you will notice that it's very easy to litter, right? Because much like what Kwasi Prempeh said, you actually get more opportunities to litter without people seeing you. I emphasize what Kwasi said, the opportunity piece. We need to basically reduce it. But the way I will reduce it, where I will have the involvement of the young people, is what I will call our collective expectations. Right now, our collective expectations is sort of low when it actually comes to the parking lot and whether it's organized or not organized, right? We don't care when people litter. We say, oh, you're too littered and whatnot. Our collective expectations, the strength of it would discourage and sort of also make the politicians sit up. The only problem is this. For the young people, all of you went through primary school and secondary school. In middle school and primary school, there is a course, JSS and middle primary schools, there is a course called RME. It's called Religious and Moral Education. That course, literally, there is no civics in there. There is no organic morality in there. So a lot of our kids are coming through where the collective expectations of what it means to basically to fight for the right things, to be moral, to be upright in society, to respect and whatnot, is literally missing. So I will ask the young people to demand that collective expectations become part of the what government actually prioritizes, such that we all have our expectations raised, right? And then finally, with what Kwasi Prempeh said, corruption happens everywhere. The only problem is this: when it happens in rich country, it's almost like a mouse in a rich man's house, as opposed to a mouse in a poor man's house. A mouse in a poor man's house fights for the food with the poor man. A mouse in a rich man's home literally fights for the food with his dog. So the effect of corruption on us is just unexcusable. And to me, we have to figure out a way to put more lights on it and lift our collective expectations in that country such that people basically feel like, you know what, I've got to make it a personal responsibility. So with that, let me turn it over to Kwasi and you.
And I think there's definitely a role for an engaged citizenry, and the idea that we do democracy almost like the way we do, Premier League and sports and everything. We are very good. Well, we like voting. We like to, after voting we retire. We don't keep vigilant. We outsource it to CDD. What are you saying about this? CDD, we have
Exactly. That needs to stop.
This is just, citizens must organize, must move, and must use voice, and we really have to stay engaged the entire period, not just on election day 4 years apart. And I think that basically we have entrusted our everything to these people. We have entrusted the country's resources, the entirety of it, forests, water bodies, natural resources, everything. And we cannot leave them to run it anyhow they like, any way they like, until the 4-year, tenure is due. So we pass the life and death issue for us, for the next generation. I think citizens really are not sufficiently engaged. We talk to each other a lot, sometimes on behalf of these political classes. So you go on social media, we are vibrant social media, but we are mostly almost like divided, fighting amongst ourselves as opposed to focusing on the game and making sure that these guys serve our interest. So I really think that, we really have to, take our civic voice very seriously, our civic role very seriously, and those with more voice, of course, we all don't have the same equal voice. Those with more voice, either because they have superior access to information or knowledge or whatever, must also see some virtue, as almost like a civic responsibility to speak on behalf of the less privileged. There isn't much of that. You don't see a lot of that. There are a lot of people who just are so concerned about themselves, about finding their own private solutions to every public problem, that they take themselves out of the public problem. But it's not sustainable. Not all of us can buy a V8 to deal with, the impassable roads. Not all of us can buy solar or a generator to deal with the unreliable electricity. Not all of us can take our kids to Lincoln because the public schools are failing. We need to, basically accept some responsibility as citizens with privilege and basically fight for the less privileged oftentimes, instead of exiting the problem all the time and leaving the problem to fester to the detriment of the majority of the people. I mean, a lot of us went to, primary public school. I went to a public day nursery. I went to a public elementary school, the one they call Saito today. Today, my peers, no one in my peer group takes their kid there, right? No one in my peer group would take their kid to a public school. The public school I went to is almost falling apart completely, almost disappeared on the face of the earth. But, so, the future generation is not having the same opportunity. And yet, Saito produced many of us, right? So I think that it is really also this sense of noblesse oblige and, this sense of responsibility that comes with privilege, with superior standing in society, and with the fact that you have advantages others don't have. We must basically also emphasize that, because not all citizens have equal voice, equal influence on the system, and those of us who happen to have access by virtue of education, by virtue of the kind of work we do and whatever, must also understand that we have an obligation to the larger society.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. This has been a wonderful conversation. I can't even tell you to wrap this up. There's a lot about basically going back to the basics and getting your foundations right. It's about asserting our agency, even as citizens, and also working out education, especially around civics and governance. So to my guests, Professor Prempeh, Professor Kwapong, I want to say a very big thank you. And to the team at CDD-Ghana, which includes both of you, thank you again allowing me to be part of this conversation and to hear your insights. It's been incredibly wonderful. And I hope all the audience listening to this also enjoyed.
Thank you for listening to the CDD-Ghana Democracy Dialogues podcast. Stay engaged, stay informed, and be part of the conversation on governance, democracy, and development. Don't forget to follow us on YouTube, Spotify, and visit our website for more insightful discussions.